So there's three very broad categories in my metapsychology, and this is captured in a series of lectures I did on the Stoa and then in the transcripts related to them. And I developed a framework for trying to organize the field of psychology based on a fundamental ontology that was separately derived, which came originally from Charles Sanders Peirce and then Forrest Landry and others. So the initial big three is development, ensoulment, transcendence. You could also read that intelligence / development, ensoulment / personality, transcendence / consciousness. So those are the big three. And you can organize a whole bunch of stuff in those terms, which I do in those lectures. If you're talking about wisdom, then I kind of like to think about, okay, how does wisdom show up across those three? And then I use those additional terms. So in the domain of intelligence, you have polymathy. How does wisdom appear in the domain of intelligence? As a kind of integral polymathy. That's how wisdom appears in the domain of intelligence. How does wisdom appear in the domain of ensoulment, personality? It appears as a kind of prophetic capacity. And then how does wisdom appear in the domain of the transcendent? That's kind of easy. It appears as awakening. So that's the idea. It's the specific terminology that's wisdom related across those three fundamental modalities of the psyche as I characterize them.
Yeah, this is really kind of fascinating. Even before I came across like your work, I was also kind of like looking at human development and like putting different things together. And like the three words or like the three categories that were popping up for me was heal, grow, and awaken. Mm. And the way that I was understanding like heal, that's like, processing your trauma, processing your shadows, and also coming into relationship, because healing doesn't happen in isolation. It's very much relational. And then grow is kind of similar to how I understand like your development part. That's, the increasing your complexity, being able to solve more problems, step into the world and engage with it. And then awaken is just the same as transcendence, really. So it's really interesting how I had these three words. Like for some reason, like, I don't know, like I'm actually really curious how you parse these categories, because I'm sure you had like a way more systemic, deep way of doing it. For me, it was almost like intuitive. I was just like feeling into it. Like, yeah, there's these three things that I feel in my own development, like, and they're interrelated, they're connected. But it's kind of useful for me to look into these three categories. So I'm curious how you came up with these three categories of development, enrollment, and transcendence.
There's a whole thing about triples just being somehow foundational to the intellectual architecture of the cosmos. So that's another, we'll put that aside. But, and then Soryu here works resuscitating some basic distinctions in Buddhism with a triple of wisdom, love, and power, which also maps to my three, which map to your three pretty well. Power being intellect, wisdom being transcendence, love being ensoulment, with your healing being ensoulment, grow being development, and awakening being transcendent. So again, I kind of touched on this in the lectures, but it started for me as a graduate student, where I was reading foundational metaphysics and philosophy, especially Charles Sanders Peirce and Kant and Whitehead and Deleuze and people like that, while I was getting a degree in human development, psychology, educational neuroscience. And similar to Greg Henriquez, actually, whose work you might know of, is a unified theory of knowledge and psychology. When you look at the field of psychology as a philosopher, you kind of want to tear your hair out. Like, it's just a mess. Like, we don't know what we're talking about. So you have people doing archetypal dream analysis, right? Are called psychologists. But then you have people who are basically figuring out how your eyeball relates to your visual cortex and how that, like, those are also psychologists. Like, people studying like monkeys, mating behavior, comparative psychology, and people studying altered states of consciousness that are induced by chemicals like DMT, right? So it's like, that's all one field. It seems like there's a bunch of different implicit ontologies presupposed by all of these different things all under one field, which doesn't exist, like, let's say, in physics or biology, where what we're studying and what we're doing is very clear. So I started to use specifically Charles Sanders Peirce's metaphysics, and being inspired by Ken Wilber also, to create a metapsychology that would allow me to bring coherence to the field of psychology, by saying, oh, that is this aspect of the psyche. Oh, that is this aspect of the psyche. Oh, that is this aspect of the psyche. So you get a way to principally and philosophically, usefully organize the different fields of psychology. Peirce's metaphysics is very, very interesting. Charles Sanders Peirce is, I think, probably one of the most important philosophers ever to live. He was an American, founder of American pragmatism, but much more than that. He had the first, I would say, non-dual evolutionary cosmology that was in conversation with post-Darwinian science. So all the stuff we talk about, evolutionary spirituality and these visions of an evolving cosmos where the human function within the evolving cosmos is distinct, and Peirce was seeing all of that and also tried to divide the universe in this very categorical way between basically I, we, and it. So this sounds familiar to anyone in integral theory. That's the first foundational triple. Deeper than I, we, and it. Peirce just called it firstness, secondness, and thirdness. And they were mathematical categories, actually, syntactic, logical, grammatical categories for Peirce, built into the structure of language and the very nature of semiotics or sign transfer, was this distinction that revealed us something about the very nature of reality itself. So I, we, and it. And that's the root of it. And then you just start to work on, what are the psychologies that are concerned primarily with first-person phenomenological experience. There's a whole bunch of psychologies concerned with first-person phenomenological experiences. I put those mostly in the transcendent. And then there are these psychologies concerned mostly with interpersonal relationship in the life world, the internalization of linguistic schemes and relationships and all that stuff. This is kind of what I apply class in Ensoulment, psychodynamics, Freud, analytical psychology, archetypal psychology, and a bunch of other stuff, shadow work, some forms of circling, a whole bunch of stuff. And then right? This is the dimension of the intellect. The intellect is fundamentally, and growth in human development is often very fundamentally about gaining the capacity to operate on the world effectively. So that's the isolation of it from everything else, and an entire domain of relating to truth, objective truth, and instrumental capacities. So that's where you put the cognitive sciences, cognitive neuroscience, and a great deal of what goes on in kind of Anglophile psychology departments, I would say. So that's where it first started. And then I just kind of sat with it because I ended up moving into doing philosophy of education and social justice work around standardized testing, and then flowing into this field of existential risk and thinking about philosophy and education more broadly. But it was always sitting there in these notebooks, this collection of kind of like really good insights from when I was being trained as a psychologist, essentially. And then it was on the Stova that Peter invited me, and it was just a forcing function. I threw together some slides and kind of laid it out. I have a plan to eventually work it up into a more formal book-length treatment, but have not had the opportunity. And I'm still learning about the mind, especially my own, and all of its problems, and other people's, and the brilliance and beauty of the psyche. Most psychologists, actually people in fields that are like psychology, like philosophy and history, don't do their best work until they're in their 50s and 60s. So I've got a little bit of time to gestate the metapsychology. So that was the origin of it. It was really in fundamental metaphysics, and relating that to the field of psychology as it stood when I was a graduate student, attempting to just organize that. It ends up being very useful for general orienting discussions in the human potential movement and kind of spirituality and new religion scene. And that was the language that I adopted. Ensoulment, transcendence, and development was directed towards those folks and wisdom teachers and people of that ilk. But there's another way to do it where you don't have to do that, where you could present it in a context of academic metapsychology. But I don't have a job in a university, so I don't have to do that.